I was interested in the fact that about 80% of you are non-profit. And I've got a question for you. And this question is partly in the context of having been a non-profit CEO for 8 years before my role at the Centre for Social Impact. It's a complex question. I don't know how this one's going to fly. My question is about the level of confidence that you would have that if you demonstrably improved the outcomes you delivered for every dollar invested in your organisation and were able to comprehensively measure and report that, what is your level of confidence that the level of funding you would receive would naturally increase as a consequence of that? And I'll give you very low, low, not sure, middle or high. So, got the question? What is your level of confidence that your funding would increase if you could demonstrate a dramatic improvement in the outcomes you deliver for every dollar invested in your organisation? Who would say very low? Anyone? Low? Middle? Not sure? Who thinks very high confidence that their funding would increase? A few. Okay. Thank you. The other thing I was hoping to announce this morning, but I checked with Jeremy, I was hoping to be able to say that this is the largest conference ever held in the world on the subject of outcomes measurement. And I thought if I could ask Jeremy that, he would know. And he said, actually, there's been one bigger one that he can think of, which had about 350 people, and we've got nearly 300. So I'm hoping that a lot of you can go and grab some mates at lunchtime and bring about 52 people back. No. But I think it is a very, very encouraging sign that this is a space that is attracting such interest. I wouldn't have thought, when we started talking about this as a conference topic, that measuring outcomes was very sexy. We've had conferences on entrepreneurship, on social finance, a whole bunch of trendy things. Is outcomes measurement really becoming that trendy? I don't know. Maybe most of you are here because you're hoping that you can learn how to get more funding. If so, I would hope that's a longer term objective, but I don't think it's the reason you should be here for the next 2 days. So we'll see how we go with that. And I think in particular in the context of the size of our country, Australia, including Tasmania, that the opportunity we have as a social impact system, which is something I want to talk about this morning, to base what we do on a stronger definition and measurement of outcomes and to really change how effective our system is an amazing opportunity. And I think if we can get a few things right over the next few years, we can make quantum change in the effectiveness of our social impact system. And that's really what I want to talk about this morning. We're a nice, fairly neat, small country to have a crack at this. We have strong underlying social systems. We have less impact, arguably, of global economic crises. We have the opportunity in the next 5, 10 years to really make some strides in this space. So I've started to talk about something that I've called the social impact system, and I just want to quickly give you some sort of a definition of that. By that, I'm talking about the structures, the organisations, the people, the ways in which we try to create positive social outcomes in Australia across government, non-profit, social enterprise and corporate. And I want to set a little bit of context for that on the next slide, which is a very quick and dirty picture of the order of magnitude of the amount of funding we spend on social purpose in Australia and where it is. And I think it's really important that we base our discussions around improving the social impact system in context. And I'll give you a very quick example. One of CSI's key stakeholders is passionate about the field of philanthropy. And this person would really love us to do a lot of research about how we could grow the level of plan giving, high net worth individual philanthropy in this country. Because by comparison with the US, I'm sure you've all heard this argument, we don't give very much. Now, I happen to agree with him, and I think there is some opportunity to do that. But I want to really focus on questions like that in the context of why we're interested. I'll come back to that one in just a second, but let me bring up this next slide. Oh, I've got one in between. This slide. Now, our collective government turnover, state and federal, I haven't got the figures on local, is something well over $500 billion a year, of which probably close to 60%, but depending on what you count, more than half is spent on social purpose. I've put conservatively 200 billion a year on this slide. I think it's probably closer to 250 and arguably higher than that. Of that, 30 billion is paid to organisations in the non-profit sector for service delivery. More is paid to organisations that are for-profit, also for service delivery, for example in health, but there are other examples. And I don't have figures on how much that is. I'd like to flesh this model out as we go in the coming year. The non-profit sector's total turnover, I think, is approximately 90 billion. Now that's an estimate based on some fairly old data now, age forward at about 3% per annum. So just some orders of magnitude here. Given that most of you are from the non-profit sector, let me talk a little bit more about the 90 billion that is income for non-profits. Half of that is through your own fees for services. It's 45 billion, roughly speaking, that you attract by charging money for the services that you deliver and related income. Of the rest, the other 45 billion, about 30, as I've already said, is government funding, leaving 15 billion. Of that, the majority is fundraising, and I mean small stuff like Red Nose Day and Pink Ribbon and child sponsorship. We think perhaps 1.5 billion at most is income from the large foundations, high net worth individuals. So I come back to the question about why we would be interested in potentially doubling the amount of high net worth individual giving in Australia if what we're doing is doubling from a fraction of 1%, maybe to 1% of the total of our social purpose income. Now, there are reasons why I am interested in doing that. I think philanthropy has a very important role to play, but I think we've got to be talking about what that role is and how effectively philanthropy is playing that role. And I'll just give that as an example. It's obviously not the subject for the next 2 days. But my point is this, that we have a very big, a very complex, very fragmented, I would argue, system for delivering social outcomes. And one of my key concerns is to think about how effective that system is and to base those discussions really well in context of understanding what the system looks like. Just before I move on from that, I don't mean to imply that our social impact system is or ever will be a neat, orderly, structured set of processes or one that we can exactly touch and feel and see. I think of it more of a biological system where there's a whole bunch of stuff happening. But in our system, people make decisions, resources get allocated, priorities get determined, some things get funded, some don't. We put our people on certain priority issues. How does that complex mix of organisations and funding and processes determine where to place the priorities? Are the incentives we give individuals and organisations within this broader system aligned well with what we would want from the system as a whole? And that's something I think we don't yet understand very well, but I think it's fundamentally important to our future. So another question for you, might be my last one, we'll see how we go. How are we doing? What's your view of the effectiveness of the social impact system across state, federal, local government, non-profits, social enterprise, social business, local, Indigenous health, welfare, education, whatever you would like to include in the broader system of social impact? Over a 10 or 20 or 30-year period, do you think that our effectiveness, and I'll define that for now as outcomes delivered per dollar invested, do you think it's an exponential growth? Do you think it's bumbling along, slow, steady, nothing too exciting? Do you think it's flatline? We're not really improving the outcomes we deliver collectively for every dollar we invest? Or do you think we're going backwards? So I'll give you those 4 options, and I'm going to ask for a show of hands. If you don't feel comfortable with the question because you don't have a big enough view or you think it's an odd question, that's fine. I'll just see how we go. I've got my own opinion, but I guess one of the points I want to make is we probably don't really know. Okay, who thinks we have exponential growth? Fantastic learning system, slow and steady improvement? Flatline? Bumbling backwards? Not many exponential growth, fair spread over the rest. I'll give you a 5th option, and we can have another show of hands. And I'll put a question mark next to this, I don't know. If I gave you that option, Would that be where a lot of you would have sat? Put your hand up again if you've already voted. Who thinks it's about there? A few. Okay, not clear consensus by any stretch. And I'm sure the answer to that is wholly dependent on the field in which you operate, and there'll be quite a variety. Okay, now I want to come to the main question I want to talk about today. What is the value of measurement? And I thought we could have a crack in a minute at calculating it. Being an engineer, of course. Maybe I should have been an economist, but no. But before I do that, I'll give you some other people's answers to this question. What is the value of measurement? There is a distinguished international leader of outcomes measurement who may or may not be on the program for the next couple of days. And he likes keeping his hand down. And I asked him a slightly different question. What's the most important benefit? What's the best thing we've gotten out of our attempts to measure outcomes? And I think he will certainly broaden this tomorrow. I don't think it's quite as simple as this in his mind. But maybe that it forces people to go back and focus on what they were trying to achieve in terms of outcomes in the first place. If you're not yet reading some things that Mario Marino is putting out, things like Leap of Reason, it's worth having a look. It's not about pushing non-profits to drink the metrics Kool-Aid, implement fancy reporting technologies, or adopt complex measurement methodologies. It's about encouraging non-profits and funders to cultivate for themselves an outcomes-focused mindset and the passion to be as effective as we possibly can for those who serve. Well, part of what I like about that is this, that in my time in the non-profit sector, I've had a lot of people argue with me that I'm being too mathematical. I'm trying to focus on measurement where measurement is too difficult. I'm too focused on numbers. And perhaps I'm a bit heartless. But my answer to that is I care about the numbers because I care about the people so much that I want to make sure we're doing the best that we can. And behind every number is a person. It's been attributed to a lot of different people, this quote. I think it's probably Drucker, Peter Drucker, but it may have been somebody else originally. You can't manage what you can't measure in simple terms, something that we might talk more about over the next day or two. And a typical US foundation manager said recently, you can achieve incredible progress if you set a clear goal and find a measure that will drive progress towards that goal. This may seem basic, but it's amazing how often it's not done and how hard it is to get right. And I wholeheartedly agree with those comments. And when I say he's a typical US foundation manager, it's a guy by the name of Bill Gates. And that was quoted in the Wall Street Journal and several other publications a couple of weeks ago. So the area of outcomes measurement is becoming news. It's becoming more and more recognised, even now in some mainstream media, as a major issue. So what's the value of measurement? Let's have a go. I'm going to make some really crass, broad, simple assumptions and see what that does to a little model over the next couple of pages, so bear with me. Let's say that there is a funder who has $100 to spend on social outcomes each year. In this very simple, oversimplified system, there are 10 organisations, and at the moment each of them receive 1/10 of the funding in a nice, even, democratic society. But the organisation's effectiveness, and again I'm defining that for simple discussion as outcomes for every dollar invested, is quite variable. It ranges from 55 outcomes for every $100 invested to 145 outcomes for every dollar invested. So one of the questions, perhaps rhetorically, is do you think there is that kind of variation in the effectiveness, the delivery of outcomes in organisations in some social spaces in Australia? I certainly do. I think that there are some organisations, and I've heard other people say similarly, who may even be destroying value, and the range could be 300%, 400%, 500% in some places, not every. Again, we probably don't have enough evidence to support that. Okay, so the funder funds organisations, they deliver programs and services, and we try to deliver outcomes. And at the starting state, 100 outcomes are delivered when you take the average of the performance of those organisations. Okay, next, let's assume that the effectiveness of each of these organisations is improving at 1% a year. Slow, steady, low level of improvement. We're not yet measuring outcomes or trying to do anything about that in the system. I've got two scenarios, 1A and 1B, in which the individual organisations start to measure outcomes and lift their level of improvement from 1% per annum to 3% per annum. Another question here, do you think that's achievable with good, strong outcome measurement? I've got case studies that would do 50 or 100%, but let's say a couple of percent extra each year is achievable. And I've got another scenario where instead of 3%, it's 5%, so that's scenario 1B. Then in the second set of scenarios, it's the same level of improvement within each organisation, lifting from 1% a year to 3 or to 5% improvement each year in outcomes delivered. But on top of that, the funder is now looking across the 10 organisations and reallocating some money. They can reallocate, the funder can reallocate 5% of their total funding each year from organisations in the bottom half to organisations in the top half. Only 5% a year. A couple of other things, there is a cost of measurement. To do this outcome measurement, I'm charging the system 5% of the total system funding. So if that was $100 million, I'm giving you, the outcomes measurer, $5 million to do your outcomes measurement. Could you do a fair bit with $5 million every year? Maybe. And that applies to all scenarios except the base case, where there is no measurement. There is a time delay. Organisations don't improve their internal effectiveness for 3 years. The funder doesn't start to change their funding, reallocate funding, for 5 years in this system. So, are we better off or worse off? As a system, in a 4 or 5 year period, at best we might break even. In a typical funding period, 3 years, we're not going anywhere. We're going backwards because we incur the cost but no benefit. So it doesn't look overly promising if the focus is short term. But exactly the same set of assumptions over 15 or 20 years create massively different outcomes. And here's a quick summary of that. What's the value of measurement? Well, in that little model, the value ranges from a return on investment of nearly 2 in the lowest of the scenarios up to over 7. That is, for every dollar spent on measurement, we're returning 730% with a discount rate of 5% built in. So there is a strong theoretical return on investment for investment in measurement, especially if you take the systems view where those effects are multiplied. Now, of course, that is a gross oversimplification. We can't achieve that through measurement alone. A whole raft of other things are needed. I'll come back to that in just a second. But I would argue we can't achieve those sorts of improvements without measurement. Fundamentally important to creating a feedback loop and a system that learns and grows and evolves. So why aren't we doing this already? A few quick points. I'm just going to quickly check my watch. Yeah. I've got a couple more slides to go and we should be all right. So there are a lot of barriers. Someone has to pay. It's a cost now, it's a benefit in the future. Everybody's budget is under duress. In some cases, it can be a showstopper, and there are some examples of social investment where there isn't 2% to play with, let alone 5%. It will kill a business case. So we've got to figure out how to do that. Some solutions. We need a lot more positive examples about how outcome measurement has achieved change in behaviour, change in performance. We need better education for our boards, for our funders, across government, non-profit funders, foundations as well. We need to give more attention to the cost of not measuring, and I think this is a huge one. We are burning, I would argue, tens of billions of dollars in funding in our large $300 billion system because we're not improving at the rate that we should be. There is a huge risk averseness, and for good reason, I think, complex reasons, especially in government, to doing things differently. But if the spotlight was more keenly focused on what is the opportunity cost of not improving, maybe we can change that. And in some cases, we need to choose when to apply measurement. We don't need to win this battle across every example all at once. Let's start with the obvious cases, the good cases, and build the evidence and go forward a year at a time. Timeframes, I've already suggested, are crucial in this. If our timeframes are 3 years, you wouldn't do it. We have got to think long term. We've got to fund long term for this to make sense. And perceptions are an issue. You can't measure what we do Well, I'm keen to hear the discussion over the next couple of days. It's my view that there aren't too many things we can't now have some kind of a good crack at measuring. And as I've already suggested, there's fear of focus on a number. Me in particular, with my focus on Excel, are heartless. Well, I think part of the answer to that is an understanding of a couple of things. Some good case studies will help. That the reason we're doing this is that we care about the outcomes for the individuals. And finally, people make decisions, not spreadsheets. Outcomes measurement is an input to that. We've got to have greater faith in the people we put into decision-making resource allocation positions. Methodology debate. Who's going to believe us if we can't agree with ourselves about how to go about measurement in these spaces? We do need to do some more in building our best practice guidelines and thinking about the bigger picture rather than complex details of individual methodologies on the big stage. Okay, a little change of pace. A quick intro to the Centre for Social Impact and a quick advertisement before I wrap up. The Centre for Social Impact was formed in 2008. It's a partnership of 4 universities. And it was formed with $12.5 million from our federal government and $1 million each from 8 founders, 4 corporates, many of whom are speaking over the next 2 days. I think 3/4 of them are represented in the program, and 4 individuals, including David Gonski, Daniel Petrie, Warwick Negus and Robert Crawford. Over the first 4 or 5 years, the Centre for Social Impact has established a teaching program, a research agenda, and has built, I think, a fabulous network of stakeholders and people around the organisation, a raft of activity. I commenced with the centre 12 months ago, and I've been really focusing in that time with our boards and advisory councils and partners on this question: what are the keys to improving social impact in Australia? And I think that's a fundamentally important question, not just for the Centre for Social Impact, but for our social impact system, as I've been suggesting. And without going into too much detail, I'll give well, I've got an advertisement break first, but I'm going to give a model that positions the need to measure outcomes and report outcomes very much in the context of that question, the keys to improving social impact. And the advertisement break is this. You've got very little time, I hope it's still open, to enrol for the graduate certificate in social impact at any of our partner universities. Enrol now. There is some great content in that course, by the way, about outcomes measurement, impact measurement. Sign up if you haven't already for our newsletter and blogs. Watch out for a relaunch of our focus for the next 5 years in a couple of months or so from now. There'll be a lot of news over that next 2 or 3 months about new people and new focus areas and projects that we'll be doing. And if anything I've said has interested you and you're an organisation or someone that might be a good partner for us, I'd love to hear from you. Find me in the break. End of advertisement. So what are the keys to improving social impact in Australia? I don't really have time to give this model a lot of depth. But over the last year, we've consulted now with at least 200 individuals and a variety of organisations, not just in Australia and overseas, around the question, what are the keys to improving social impact? If you could change 2 or 3 or 5 things to most greatly improve our system for social impact, what would they be? And these 5 or 6 themes, there's a couple that will come in a second, were very strongly the consensus from that consultation. And it's the Centre's intention to focus our research, our advocacy, our teaching around these themes over the coming years. Firstly, we need to define the purposes of our organisations, our activities, our funding in terms of outcomes in the first place. As Bill Gates said, it's amazing how badly we do that. Second, we need to effectively measure and transparently report our delivery of those outcomes, and we can debate more levels of measurement of activity, outcome and impact over the next day or so. Thirdly, we need funding that is going to respond and reward the effective delivery of social outcomes. I would love to see the 80% of you who are non-profit service deliverers put your hand up when I ask the question, do you believe that if you improve your outcomes, measure and report them, funding will follow you? I would love to see you all put your hand up. Those 3 points together, in my mind, create a market or an ecosystem or an evolutionary learning playing field for the effective delivery of social outcomes. And I don't think that's what we have today, which is why I think we're bubbling along, not exponentially growing our effectiveness. But I also want to say there are some other parts to this model that matter. Funding and measurement won't do it on its own. We also need to be great at fostering and scaling effective social innovation, and those innovations have to re-enter the mainstream funding model, and that can take 5 or 10 years. I think we foster a fair bit, I think we scale very little, and we've got to figure that out. We've got to change the mainstream, otherwise the innovation is not worth much. There is no value in new unless we implement. We need great people in the management, leadership and governance of social purpose across sectors, and we need to be much better at collaborative and participative approaches to social design and implementation. A quick example on that last one before I wrap up with one more slide. There is in Australia a community of 800 people. It's a very disadvantaged community. At work in that community are 64 government and non-profit agencies. There is one community worker in that community for every 5 people. I'll wager that a bunch of those agencies and programs are delivering on activity and output targets, and yet in that community we've made no measurable change in any significant social outcome indicator over the last decade. We have got to do things differently, and collaboration, among other things, is one of the ways in which we've got to change that picture. Okay, outcomes measurement and reporting, as long as it drives behaviour change, drives resource reallocation, is fundamentally important to that picture. The keys to improving impact. Measurement starts with defining outcomes. We need effective measurement and transparent reporting. I think governments have got to be more open with the data that they hold for that to work. We've got to look at shared measurement of the big picture, both so that we can see the big picture and as one strategy for reducing the cost of measurement. We've got to reward those who are open to this and future focused. Now, there's going to be some pain if this system comes about. There are going to be organisations who receive less funding. But if the directions are right, we've got to stand together and say this is the right thing to do. And as I've said, measurement is pointless unless we change behaviour. Resource reallocation must follow. Funders, especially governments, must be very brave with this, and we must support them. In conclusion, and my last slide, the value of measurement. What is the value of measurement? Well, I've argued that it's 730% return on investment if you take a systems view. Of course, that's oversimplified. Systems resist change, but we'll see how we go. Without measurement, and this is probably my main point, we can't create an evolving learning system. We need measurement to do that. We need good measurement to do that. And without a learning system, we're not going to achieve the social impact that we need to achieve over the next 2 or 3 decades of ageing population, increasing tax pressures, shrinking workforces. So, I'll close with that. The fate of our social impact system rests with you. Have a great couple of days. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to jump to some questions for Andrew. There's some microphones, so if you have a question, pop your hand up and someone will come to you with a microphone. Over here, yep.
Hi, Narelle Haywood from the Department of Human Services. I'm curious about the data question, given what you've just said. What level would you like to see the data available at?
I think that's a hugely complex question, and I think it really depends on the field that we're talking about. Let me give you an example. For a few years I was the CEO of a cancer support organisation called Canteen, and Canteen won a big chunk of federal funding to try and change the way state hospitals delivered cancer services for teenagers. We could not get, after 3 years, any data on the performance of state cancer systems for teenagers from any state, in spite of this mandate and this funding to deliver change. It was de-identified. It wasn't going to identify anything close to an individual or even a hospital that we were looking for. But I think one of the resistances was just that it's not standard practice to be open with this information. And secondly, I'm guessing that the states were worried that we would show that there are strong regional differences, even within a state, in the performance of the system. And the state doesn't want people to know that. outside of the system, it can be used very negatively. And I get that. But it's very difficult to be involved in system change unless you've got information. So it was extremely frustrating. And I've heard many, many stories like that.
Do you have a question on this side of the room? Yep. Woman at the back of the room on the left.
Thank you very much. I'm Angela Savage from the Houses and Learning Centres in Victoria. I put up my hand probably expressing a bit of cynicism about whether funding reallocation would follow the demonstration of effective outcomes, because I'm very conscious of how politicised funding allocation is, and I've been witness to various scenarios where, in fact, an organisation can present a very strong evidence base for the value of what they do, but be passed over for funding because another organisation has better networks, particularly old boy networks. And I'm just interested in your comments on that and how we can affect change with decision makers about to depoliticise funding allocations. Is it even possible?
Is it possible? Look, firstly, I agree with your observation, and we could pull apart the $90 billion in non-profit funding in a lot more detail and ask the question, with each kind of funding, what relationship between this source of funding and effective outcome delivery is there? For example, in fundraising, you've got to be good at marketing. Pink is a fantastic idea. I'm talking about Pink Ribbon here. To expand on that example a little bit, if I got a group of 20 cancer experts into this room, one of whom was a paediatric cancer expert, one of whom was a breast cancer expert, and the others were from various other cancer fields, and asked them to objectively agree on whether the next dollar should be invested in cancer, they would all agree, including the paediatrician and the breast cancer expert, that it should be anything other than paediatric cancer or breast cancer. They are massively over-resourced by comparison with the others, and yet there's got to be a 60 or 70% chance that the next philanthropic dollar is going to one of those two, the next fundraising dollar, because of the power of marketing in those spaces. I think that the answer is transparency. If we set up the goals that we're working to in each area of our social impact system, and if they are transparent, we create powerful motivations, political motivations, to focus on effectiveness. I also genuinely think that most people in the system want to make the right decision, and where they don't, it's because it's too fragmented, too complex, it's not clear enough that the outcomes are really being delivered in one space versus another. And yes, there are other political influences that I think have too much impact on those decisions. But can it change? I wouldn't be in this job unless I believe that it can. I think it's extremely hard, and I think it's a 10-year journey.
Okay, next question. Yep.
Hi, is that on? Yeah. My name's Kerry Nettle. I'm from Parramatta City Council. Just with regard to your answer to the last question, I agree with you, it is possible, and I think many of us wouldn't be here if we didn't believe it was possible. But I want to take up your point about transparency, because I acknowledge that transparency is needed in order for us to influence decision makers, but I think we need to go further than transparency, because once we've got the transparency, there needs to be the public support for the effective decision making being made by the funders, because there are models that are moving towards ensuring funders are more transparent in terms of the decision making that they make. But if there's not a public groundswell for ensuring that funders make decisions which are ensuring and based on effectiveness and measuring social outcomes, then the transparency doesn't deliver for us. So I think we need to take that one step further in terms of there being broad public support for funders making those effective decisions.
Yep. I completely agree, and I think that our sector, the non-profit sector in particular, has got to be one of the strong voices in that.
One more question just down here at the front.
Hi, Andrew. My name's is that too loud? My name's Wendy Reed from Australia's CEO Challenge. Pretty new to all of this. But could you give us some practical, concrete examples of social impacts based on your experience in the charitable sector and the non-for-profit sector? I just want to get a feel for, you know, what actually a social impact is, and then maybe an example of how it's measured.
firstly, we could get into a long, complex conversation about the difference between outcomes and impact. And you've couched the question in terms of impact, which I think is a very difficult question for me to answer. I think there are many examples of a cluster of outcomes being delivered much more effectively. Again, without naming it, I know of an example of an Indigenous community population, several hundred, that has got this right and is really improving education, employment and other outcomes. And if you look at that community as a whole, you would say that's a positive impact. And it's been done with great collaboration between a couple of government departments and several non-profits. And it's, I think, a really good example of how we could be doing it elsewhere. But I think those examples are just that, they're small examples. I haven't seen cases where large chunks of the system have got this lined up and are really starting to deliver. I don't yet have a good view of overseas. I'd love to understand, particularly in a developed country context where I think the barriers are different. I'd like to see larger examples of that happening. I haven't yet seen them. I've seen some in developing country contexts, but I think they're very different playing fields, and I think that the opportunity to achieve outcomes where you're starting from a much lower impact, where you're starting from a much lower baseline, where there's less established infrastructure that you've got to then try and mess with, I think that's a different case. I want to see it in a developed country. So no, I don't have good impact level answers for you. Others might, and there are plenty of people in this room that may be able to stand up and give an example, so watch out for the next day or so.